Hello and welcome to the final lecture in MN4354. This is the final asynchronous downloadable lecture material. And this is a lecture on non-monetizable impacts and the decision matrix. So how do we incorporate what are non-monetizable impacts into cost-benefit analysis? And one of the tools that we do use to do so is the decision matrix. So what we're going to cover in this lecture are first, again, to review the types of costs and benefits. So to provide context for this particular lecture, or the content that we're going to cover today. Then we're going to talk about, what are types of non-quantifiable impacts, and these are usually benefits. Then defining selection criteria, sort of the general principles for how we define selection criteria, in particular when some of the impacts are non-quantifiable or non-monetizable. Then we're going to talk about comparing the alternatives, how we actually compare the alternatives under those selection criteria. And then we're going to introduce the idea of multi-criteria decision making. When we have non-monetizable impacts, when everything is monetizable, we actually have a single criteria, which is net benefits, maximizing net benefits to make our decisions. But when you do not have everything monetizable, then you have to get into the realm of multi-criteria decision making. And after introducing the idea of multi-criteria decision making in general, we will talk about the one such multi-criteria decision making tool, which is the decision matrix. So first, again, reviewing our categorization of the types of costs and benefits. So you may remember that we said that all impacts, whether costs or benefits, can be classified as either quantifiable or not quantifiable. And then those that are quantifiable, the easiest ones are those that are directly monetizable, right? So for example, budget impact or direct costs or total lifetime costs, these sorts of things, usually on the cost side, are directly monetizable. Although on the benefit side too, things like cost savings are certainly directly monetizable. And that was sort of what we've covered in previous weeks of the course. Now, there also are those things that are not necessarily directly monetizable, but they're quantifiable and are indirectly monetizable. We talked about that in the prior lecture. We talked about things like, valuing, life, or valuing time, and how we use things like market valuation or contingent valuation or revealed preference to assign monetary values to things that are really non-monetary benefits and costs. And today we're going to talk about these sort of the most complicated sort of category. What about if there's something that really isn't quantifiable, or certainly if it's quantifiable, it's not really monetizable, that we can't really put a money value or money number, money measure, on the cost or benefit. And we're going to talk about how we incorporate those today into cost-benefit analysis. So what might be these non-quantifiable impacts? And like I said, usually they're benefits. Well, first of all, let's go back to the steps in our Army cost-benefit analysis approach. And step 5 in the Army CBA procedure was to identify quantifiable and non-quantifiable benefits. Now, to identify these, I just wanted to, this slide is actually copied from the earlier presentation, so it's nothing new. But understand that these benefits could be, as it says, quantifiable or non-quantifiable. They could be objective or subjective, right? And we did give you some, suggestions such as, consult subject matter experts to figure out what the benefits might be. Presumably, you can talk about the benefits in terms of they presumably should solve the problem that you're trying to analyze. But there also might be other benefits, and subject matter experts might help you identify what those benefits might be. Now, again, some of the questions we ask if you're reviewing a cost-benefit analysis report. For example, do the perceived benefits reflect an enterprise perspective, as we are directed to do in all Army cost-benefit analyses? Are the benefits consistent with the problem statement, right? So, in other words, one of the benefits presumably should be that it solves the problem, and to what degree it solves the problem. And then also the idea is, have some effort been made to quantify subjective benefits. So it's sometimes very easy to try to give up on quantifying certain benefits, and in many cases they can be quantified to some degree. And so have we at least tried to make that effort? Now, think about categories of potential benefits. There are what we call objective benefits, things like cost savings, cycle time or material usage, revenue from sales of assets, improved readiness ratings, faster document processing, things that are clearly, there's no question that there is a benefit, and moreover, that they are generally measurable and therefore quantifiable, right? You can certainly improved readiness in and of itself might seem like, well, how do you measure that? Well, to the degree we have readiness ratings or we have any measures of readiness, then it is in fact an objective benefit. There's not a question about whether or not, for example, you've improved readiness or you've improved cost savings or you improved cycle time. By its very definition, if it is indeed objective, right, then it presumably must be measurable in some degree. Otherwise, it's subjective, right? So by its very nature, most objective benefits, or in fact all objective benefits, are usually quantifiable. But then there are a number of subjective benefits. Listed here we see things like customer satisfaction, morale, mission capability, quality of service, risk to Army personnel, public perception of the Army. And these things, these subjective benefits, and because they're subjective, that sort of, in other words, as opposed to objective, that suggests that we can disagree about the proper measure. So some of these may be quantifiable. Things like customer satisfaction can be measured in surveys, morale, mission capability. These sorts of things, there are ways you can quantify them. But some really may not be quantifiable, or certainly maybe more difficult to quantify. Excuse me. Public perception of the Army, for example, might be difficult thing to maybe quantify. You certainly could try to do it with surveys, etc. But again, the point is not necessarily to suggest that the top three are quantifiable and the bottom three aren't. Just to suggest that some subjective benefits might not, in fact, be quantifiable. Now, how do we deal with these non-quantifiable, or at least hard to quantify benefits? Well, one approach is simply, to identify them, just list them. It's not necessarily the idea being that even if you can't quantify them, there's still some benefit to simply listing them, and so that you are aware at least of all of the benefits that are in consideration. Why is that a good idea? Advantages are, excuse me. I apologize. It's 3 o'clock in the morning as I'm recording this, so I'm a little bit tired. So I apologize for the yawn. But the advantages, of course, are it's easy. You just list them. That makes that's certainly an easy task. But the disadvantages, of course, is there's no meaningful way to compare the benefits across COAs, right? So the idea is that you might have different benefits across different COAs. If they're just listed, right, then the idea is, okay, well, which course of action, gives us the greatest benefit? Well, you don't know because you've not actually measured them. It's also hard to compare cost to benefits for a given course of action. So what if all your costs are in dollar terms, but you've just listed all your benefits? Well, how would you ever know whether your benefits exceed your costs enough to justify actually doing the project? Another approach is to sort of rate or rank them, so some attempt to quantify or categorize. And the advantage there is it does make comparisons easier, right? If you can rate things on some scale, or you can rank courses of action in terms of their performance along different some subjective benefit measure. So it does allow you to make comparisons because you've then put some quantified measure on each of these. The disadvantage is it's ultimately still subjective, right? Who's to say, which course of action is best or or if in fact these things are not directly quantifiable, there's not an objective measure for them, then any sort of rating or ranking is going to be subjective. It's easy to game, right? It's easy to sort of adjust your ratings a little bit this way or that way to sort of get the outcome you want, and therefore you can be very sensitive to your means by which, or your approach by which you rate or rank these things. And it's certainly therefore sort of harder to achieve sort of consensus because, again, the conclusion might be a function of the way that you've rated or ranked them. And also, it also is harder to have somebody else come along and replicate your conclusions. If somebody else does the same analysis, are they going to come up with the same recommendation as you did? Well, if they choose to rate or rank these subjective benefits differently, they may get different results. And therefore, you may not be able to replicate your conclusions. So let's talk about the idea of, after understanding, now that we understand some of these non-quantifiable impacts or these subjective benefits, what about the next step in the Army cost-benefit analysis approach, which is to define the selection criteria, right? So we think about what makes for good and selection criteria. Well, the idea here is, of course, what choice are we going to, what are we going to use to choose? How are we going to decide which is our best course of action? Well, to this point in the course, we've sort of talked about things that are either directly or indirectly monetizable. And in fact, if all costs and benefits are monetizable, this is definitely straightforward, right? Well, if everything's in money terms, you simply compare courses of action according to their net benefits, right? Which is total benefits minus total costs. And you select the course of action with the highest net benefit. If not all impacts are monetizable, however, so you can't simply calculate a dollar net benefit for each course of action that includes all costs and benefits, it becomes much more difficult in terms of determining the appropriate selection criteria. Right? Because ultimately, a full comparison of courses of action requires that all impacts be measured in the same units, meaning if we've measured benefits in terms of, for example, customer satisfaction, morale, accuracy, whatever it might be, that might be measured in terms of percentages or some other number, but it might not be measured in terms of dollars. And so if you can't monetize those benefits, right, then it's difficult for us to complete our cost-benefit analysis with any sort of precision, because we can't subtract benefits from costs or costs from benefits or even compare courses of action because we are unable to put everything into the same unit of measure. So what do we do? What are possible solutions when not all impacts are monetizable? Well, first thing I always say before we even ask that question is, are you sure that the impacts are not monetizable? Because sometimes things are, maybe not or difficult to quantify, but we quickly assume they're not monetizable. Whereas we saw in the prior lecture, things like how we quantify the value of life or the value of time savings. So it may very well be that they are monetizable, but it takes a little work. So first make sure that there's not some way to monetize, these benefits. Now, if they aren't monetizable, so you can't put everything in dollar terms, it's worth asking at least, is there some other common measure for costs and benefits? Maybe, in some cases you make choices where the costs and benefits, neither of them are really in dollar terms. It might just be in terms of time. It might be other things, And so is there some other common measure besides dollars for all costs and benefits? Well, if there isn't, then we might have to create one. And that's the next point, which is that when we're still left with things that are non-monetizable and there's not some new common measure for costs and benefits, we have to find a way to compare the impacts with different measures. And so therefore we have to maybe use subjective assessment, but somehow create a common measure for all costs and benefits. Okay? And we may be able to rate, rank, rate, or score, each course of action in a way that we have a common measure for all costs and benefits, and therefore can compare costs to benefits, but also can compare courses of action to different courses of action to each other. Now, what makes for a good set of selection criteria? Well, a number of things. First of all, it's obviously got to provide the benchmarks necessary to measure, evaluate, and rank order each course of action. Right? So we've got to be able to ultimately, we want to make a decision in the end. So we want to be able to measure and evaluate them, but we also, it's important to understand that we want to be able to have a measure that allows us to say that A is better than B and B is better than C, etc. So we want to be able to rank order ultimately each course of action. We want to incorporate guidance from the decision maker, right? Of course, in the end, if we're going to be creating a cost-benefit analysis report, and we are trying to decide the criteria upon which we're making our choice, well, what are the criteria that the decision maker has in mind? But also from subject matter experts, right? Because sometimes, they may have some understanding of what might be the important criteria in the particular problems which you're addressing. Now, you want to make sure you include enough to make a decision, right? You don't want to have, only, minimal sort of criteria that maybe just cost and maybe one benefit or something like that. The danger there is, of course, that you may not be enough to, not only might it not capture everything, right, but also it might be the case that it's hard to make a decision based on that, right? If you had more criteria and if you measured more things, maybe you would really begin to see separation among the courses of action. But if measured along only one or two dimensions, they might cluster together and seem very similar, and therefore it's very hard to make a definitive recommendation. Right? On the other hand, you don't want to have so many criteria that it's not really useful, as we'll see later, because some of these weightings and rankings and ratings are subjective. Including too many criteria, really can make the entire report, pretty much meaningless, because it makes it difficult to do sensitivity analysis, because you've got so many different ratings and so many different weights and criteria that you could pretty much get any result you wanted depending upon how you weighted these things. It's important that it can encompass all significant impacts of the course of action. So think about all of the benefits and all of the costs, everything negative and positive that will happen as a result of each course of action, and make sure those are all sort of accounted for in your selection criteria. If it's something small and insignificant, maybe not, but if it's a significant impact, pro or con, it should be included somewhere in your selection criteria. You also don't want them to be biased toward any particular outcome, right? Obviously, if you choose selection criteria that tend to favor one outcome going into the process, it's not going to be surprising what the result is, right? And also the idea of balancing financial and non-financial criteria, right? Because we're now talking about things that are non-monetizable. Many of these are obviously, these are non-financial because they're non-monetizable. So how do you combine the two, right? You don't want to ignore money, right? You don't want to make it seem like it's all about money, and therefore, sort of seem crass. But you also don't want to ignore things like safety, morale, or availability just because they are hard to quantify. It's sometimes easy to sort of want to throw out certain costs or benefits because you can't necessarily quantify them very easily, and so it's better to sort of cover your eyes and ignore them and pretend they don't exist than to have to actually include them and therefore quantify them. Some non-financial selection criteria that you may encounter, there are sort of your generic or common performance measures, quantity, quality, timeliness, right? These are things that we think in general are non-financial, but maybe quantifiable, maybe less quantifiable, but certainly common performance measures that don't deal in dollar terms. Other things that might be criteria that are imposed by higher headquarters. For example, in a recent bomb build, the headquarters Department of the Army directed that all issues be evaluated for their impact on Army force generation. And so again, that is important if that comes down directly from HQDA, or no, I'm sorry, indirectly, or from the HQDA at the top, or simply from other from the decision maker, him or herself, or other higher headquarters directives, make sure those are included as well. Plus other tangible but non-financial measures, things like interoperability with current systems, maintainability, fulfillment of operating requirements. These things are tangible. You can sort of say at least to some degree whether or not they've been fulfilled or not, but they are non-financial. And there actually are many more other intangible performance measures: customer satisfaction, morale, greater versatility, improved decision making, mission capability, combat effectiveness, risk to soldiers and other personnel, public perception of the Army, political goodwill. These are all sort of intangible performance measures, and we list them here because we want to make sure you're not forgetting these, right? Just because maybe you can't quantify them very easily. Don't forget, really try to figure out, in particular, if you have performance measures that differ across courses of action, then it is likely important and valuable to make sure you include them in some way. And so think about things like this and make sure when you're doing any cost-benefit analysis that you are indeed including all the important considerations. Of course, in the end, you do have to have, we will talk about, you'll have to measure, each criterion. So figure out how you're going to measure it, by whom, make sure that the entity providing the measurement is credible. Is it just going to be the cost-benefit analyst, him or herself? Is it going to be a subject matter expert, etc.? But make sure that we can, defend, who we've used to make that measurement for each course of action along each criterion. So how do we compare alternatives, right? So the next step in the Army cost-benefit analysis approach is step 7, which is to simply compare the alternatives, right? And the essence of cost-benefit analysis is either comparing cost to benefits or comparing 2 or more courses of action to identify the preferred alternative. And the general rule is that the preferred course of action is the alternative that provides the greatest value or net benefit, right? And we define value as net benefit or benefit minus costs. In that sense, it's often said that cost-benefit analysis is really, sort of value analysis. Now, remember when we compare alternatives, based on, there are different sort of decision rules based on whether costs are equal or unequal, or benefits are unequal or equal, right? And when we look at things like, the cases here, the bottom 3 cases, one where benefits are equal, or where costs are equal, or where both costs and benefits are equal, right? Which is cost effectiveness analysis and benefit effectiveness analysis. And this last one we didn't really label because obviously that means that, both equal cost, equal benefits, doesn't really matter which course of action you choose. But in those cases, notice that in one, you're selecting with the lowest cost, with the greatest benefit. There's no need to compare cost to benefits because in cost effectiveness analysis, everything has the equal benefit. In benefit effectiveness analysis, everything has the same cost, right? And so the idea is that we don't need to put costs and benefits along the same measure because everything's got the same benefits or everything's got the same costs, and therefore we only have to look at one side of the equation, and as long as we have can measure all the benefits in the same way or measure all the costs in the same way, it's not necessarily that we have the same common unit of measure for costs versus benefits. But in the more general category where costs might be unequal and benefits might be unequal across courses of action, this is your classic general cost-benefit analysis. Now we have to actually compare cost to benefits, right? If we wanted to do net benefit, we would have to do, benefit minus cost. And therefore, if you're going to combine benefits and costs, we ultimately have to use some common unit of measure. We have to convert, or you have to monetize things that are not monetary, or you've got to somehow put things in a common unit of measure so we can combine costs and benefits. And that gets us to this topic of multi-criteria decision making. So what if not all impacts can be monetized or otherwise cannot be measured in the same units, right? Then that means that we can't subtract benefits, we can't subtract costs and benefits unless both have the same unit of measure, right? We can't find net benefit, right? Net benefit is benefit minus cost. Well, we can't do benefit minus cost if benefit is measured in morale, and cost is measured in dollars, right? So what that means is once you can't get everything in terms of dollars, or you can't have everything in terms of one common measure, right? Then instead of being able to just say pick whichever has the greatest net benefit, which would be single criterion decision making, right? We're now moved into the realm of multi-criteria decision making. So now we've got multiple criteria, not all monetizable, not all dollar terms, and therefore we cannot measure them, at least on their face value, according to the same unit of measure, and therefore we can't calculate a specific net benefit number for any course of action. And that being the case, we've ultimately got to figure out a way to how do we make a decision when we have multiple criteria, maybe measured in very different terms. Now, one thing to note up front, of course, is multi-criteria decision making is inherently subjective, right? Not everything, tends to be quantifiable. So it often requires some abstract rating or ranking or scoring, right? And that obviously is a subjective assessment. How do you rate things? Is it a 7 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10? Is it really the third best option or the fourth best option? These sorts of things, no matter how you do it, are somewhat subjective. But there's also more subjectivity because it also requires some subjective weighting of criteria in terms of their relative importance. Right? So, there's several subjective elements that come into play with multi-criteria decision making, and therefore there's no way to really objectively conclude that one course of action is better than another. Right? It's intended to help you, but not necessarily clearly defined. Definitely, we know course of action number one is the best one because the MCDM approach says so. Well, because the MCDM approach is inherently subjective, it's important to recognize that, well, it suggests that maybe course of action number one we should do, but it really depends on the rating, the ranking, the weights, all these sort of subjective sort of considerations. So what, you've got to use it as a decision aid, as I will say later, but not a decision maker. So the purpose of multi-criteria decision making, therefore, is simply to improve the quality of decisions, not necessarily to make the decision for you, but to be an input and sort of help you with the decision. Certainly at least makes the choice process more explicit, rational, and efficient. But it offers, better decisions, not perfect ones, like I say. There are many different methods or approaches for multi-criteria decision making. No one method is definitively the best. The OMB A76 report, about cost-benefit analysis for federal programs, does not recommend a particular system for multi-criteria decision making. But the Army CBA guide does suggest what they call the decision matrix, or the DECMAT. And this is what you might, colloquially be referred to as a rate and weight system. So what we'll talk about in the remainder here of this lecture is that decision making. The decision matrix. How do we use the decision matrix? How is it used in incorporating non-monetizable impacts into cost-benefit analysis? Okay, so let's talk about what the decision matrix. First of all, what is it? Well, it is a multi-criteria decision-making tool, which basically means it does produce a single score for each course of action, even if you have multiple benefits and costs, some of them in dollars, some of them in different measurements, or some of them not really quantified at all in the normal sense. We'll talk about how we deal with that. And it summarizes the performance of each course of action, but also each course of action for each decision criterion. So it's sort of think of it as a report card, if you will, on each course of action, graded in each sort of decision criterion. This is, to quote the Army Cost Benefit Analysis Guide, it is, quote, one of the best ways to elucidate the resource-informed decision to senior leadership is to include a decision matrix in the decision brief, right? Or that may be a quote from a Army CBA presentation, right? So it's certainly something that the Army endorses as a decision tool. So why do you use it? Well, decision matrix helps. It's not, we haven't talked about it so far in the course, so it's not always necessary to do something like this, but it does help when some costs and benefits are not monetizable and there are multiple relevant decision criteria. So you are, instead of a single dimensional criterion such as net benefit, there are multiple criteria, and some of those are not monetizable. And it basically makes it simple. But it's important to understand the idea is to, as I said at the bottom here, and I said previously, it's a decision aid, not a decision maker. And so the idea is that it helps narrow the field of alternatives, right? It helps focus attention. It's best used to identify the front runner, sort of, okay, well, course of action, 3 and 4, are clearly better than 1 and 2. It's not really ideal as the absolute and only determinant of the ultimate winner, and this is because of its subjective nature. And sensitivity analysis is even more important with the decision matrix, because small changes to weights or ratings can change the conclusion. And so, therefore, again, the idea is think of it as a decision aid, not a decision maker. So just because the decision matrix says something doesn't, it's not like as simple as something more objectively measured, like maybe net benefits. And as you'll see, sort of, you may often have to present different sort of outcomes that you get depending on different weights and different scores. So using the decision matrix involves the following steps. Step 1, identify criteria. Step 2, assign a weight to each criterion. Step 3, rate and rank each course of action within each criterion. Step 4, calculate criterion scores for each course of action. Step 5, sum criterion scores to find overall scores. Right? And of course, I'm now going to go through each of those 5 steps to explain it in detail. So step 1 is identify the criteria. So what are the criteria in which you're going to be evaluating the different courses of action, or comparing the different courses of action? And the important thing is, besides things, to find criterion that are, of course, relevant, like what you actually care about, but also make sure you have criteria that have differences across courses of action. Sometimes I see cost-benefit analyses or reports where we evaluated them based on this criterion, whether it be maybe it was impact on or required personnel or something like that, and they were all the same, right? Which is fine to include or point out in your cost-benefit analysis report, right? To say that, look, all of our course of actions considered, require the same personnel to administer. Well, that's fine to mention in your CBA report. It doesn't necessarily need to appear in your decision matrix because the decision matrix is supposed to reflect, how the different courses of action perform differently across the different criteria. It's important to use only selection criteria, not screening criteria. What we mean by that is there's some criteria that you've got to meet that are minimum. These are called screening criteria. The idea is that if you don't cross some threshold, if you don't meet the requirements, for example, the minimum requirements, then we're not even going to consider that course of action. Well, if during your CBA you find out certain courses of action don't meet the screening requirements, again, something to include possibly in your cost-benefit analysis report, but not necessarily something to include in your decision matrix. So again, the decision matrix, remember, think about this. It is the idea that you've sort of narrowed it down to a selected number of alternatives, and you're trying to give the decision maker a sort of 10,000-foot view of the entire lay of the land. And so screening criteria, so if something doesn't meet the screening criteria, then they shouldn't even be considered at this point, right? They could be mentioned in your CBA report, in particular why you ruled them out, but they shouldn't necessarily appear in the decision matrix. So another thing is, what about cost? Do we include cost in the decision matrix? Well, the reality is, I gave you the reading on the decision matrix, the Army, CBA excerpt, as well as some other excerpts on the decision matrix and the Army's approach. And in that, they talk about not including the cost in the matrix, although they then end up including cost by using this, what we call the cost-benefit index, which we'll talk about in a second. But I would point out that some analyses, actually include cost in the matrix. In fact, some include multiple measures of cost in the matrix, which is a problem in and of itself. But So the idea is we'll talk about why it can be good or bad to not include cost as the matrix. And again, remember, cost is something that is clearly measurable, and some of these other things. The reason you're using the decision matrix are things that are not as quantifiable or not monetizable. Certainly, are the reason you're using the decision matrix. So there's. Hope you understand. There is a there is some reason to keep it cost separate because it is something you can monetize. But there are also, as you'll see, there's some benefits to actually including it in the matrix. Now, one thing's for sure though, if you're going to include cost, and you're going to include some other benefits maybe or other elements that are monetized, combine those in a single measure. In other words, we shouldn't have sort of the cost to implement and the long-term cost savings, two financial measures, as separate things in the decision matrix, because the idea is that if you as you'll see, if you end up weighting or scoring each of those, you're going to lose the precision. You're going to lose the precision of that dollar measurement. So in fact, what you want to do is combine them. So if you have some costs, if you have some benefits that are monetized, and you have costs that are monetized, right? Calculate the quantifiable net benefit, right, or net cost, depending on how it comes out, but which might be the monetized benefit minus the monetized cost, right? And have that be included in your decision matrix, and then the other things that are not monetized would also be included in your decision matrix. But the point is, don't have multiple. Again, if you've got some monetized costs, monetized benefits, don't have them as a separate entry in your decision matrix, because all you're doing is you're clouding the issue and you're losing the precision that you get from things that are monetized. So consider this example, and we'll carry this example through each of the 5 steps. Suppose you must choose a line of credit based on proposals from 4 different lenders, right? And the relevant criteria for this decision might include interest rate, upfront fees, line of credit size, restrictions, advance rate, unused line fee, default rate, perceived friendliness of lender, right? Again, it doesn't necessarily matter so much as to understand that you could have many different relevant decision criteria, and we'll show you how the decision matrix can be useful in doing that. So that'll be sort of the example that we'll carry through in each of the 5 steps. Which brings us to step 2. Step 2 is to assign a weight to each criterion. So the idea is that how important, what's the relative importance of one selection criterion over another, right? And the idea is that, okay, are these criteria equally important? One slightly more important, one less important, and this should be, of course, based on guidance from the decision maker and subject matter experts, right? But in particular, the decision maker, because you want to say, well, okay, well, how important are these considerations to you? And so again, the weights should reflect input, or guidance from outside parties, not just necessarily the analyst's opinion. So now when you're assigning weights to different criterion, right, there's mixed guidance on the appropriate scale. Some say that it should be in percentages, right? 60% of the weight goes here, 10% here, 20% here, or 0.3, 0.25, 0.45. Use these example numbers here on your screen. But it's not clear that's necessary. I mean, it's not like that makes the end score any more meaningful. It's still, I mean, you're still basically, as you'll see, you're still, assigning a rate in each thing. If you put percentages on there, it gives the illusion that you're somehow, being a little more precise, but not necessarily. You could really have any numerical weights, right? It's common to see weights, for example, between 1 and 10. Right? What really matters is the relative weighting. Right? That's all that really matters. Whether you do 60, for example, if you put weights here, you see the 60, 10, 20, they add up to 100%. But if you used weights of 6, 1, and 2, you would get the exact same conclusions, the exact same results. All that matters is the relative size or the relative weight of the different criteria. And the idea being that, look, if you weigh something with a weight of 4, it better be twice as important as something with a weight of 2, and only half as important as something with a weight of 8, right? And so you want to basically, when you assign your weights, then go and compare each of the two in sort of the pairwise comparisons. Criterion 1 and 2, does that make sense? Is if one has a 4, one has a 2, is it twice as important as the other? And then compare criterion 1 and 3, 2 and 3. So they just compare all the pairs after you've sort of assigned the weights and see if they make sense. If they don't, you might need to adjust them. So here's going back to our example, in the line of credit example, right? Suppose the weights are shown as in the table here, right? So interest rate has a weight of 8, upfront fees 3, size of the line, the line of credit 7, restriction 7, advance rate 5, unused line fee 3, default rate 5, and friendliness 7. Things to note: first of all, the weights range from 3 to 8. They notice in this particular example they don't sum to 1 or 100, right? Which again, as I mentioned, is not necessary. It's sometimes helpful. People try to think about, well, what percentage? People think in terms of percentages sometimes, right? What percentage? Of your decision is going to be based on cost, right? And so sometimes it's natural to translate that into percentage weights that then add up to 100, but it's not necessary. And notice that some different criteria are given the same way, right? This is not a listing of the most important to least important. In fact, that's for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, that can be a very bad idea, right? You actually want to make sure the relative weights matter, right? So something that again, something that's weighted an 8 should be more important than something that's weighted a 7, but not by a lot, right? Whereas it should be much more important than something that's weighted a 3. So the third step then is so now we've remembered step 1 and 2, we've identified the criteria, we've assigned a weight to each criterion. Now we want to rate or rank each course of action within each criterion, right? And you can actually break this into 2 sub-steps. You don't always need to, but it's often the case that you do 2 sub-steps. The first thing is to measure the performance of each course of action with respect to each selection criteria. So measure their performance, right? And these measurements, as we'll talk, might be very different depending upon what you're doing. If you're measuring accuracy, customer satisfaction, aesthetics or whatever, but something, these measures might be on completely different scales and completely different things, and a low score might be good on one, and a high score might be good on another. But the idea is to measure the performance, right? Because if you can't measure the performance, if you say, this is an important decision criterion, but we have no basis on which to compare the courses of action on this criterion, then you've really, it's pointless. But you've got to have some sort of way to measure them, and we'll talk about the different approaches there. And then the next thing is then to convert those measures into a numeric rating or ranking consistent across all criteria, right? Because in step 3A, the measurement may not be numeric, right? It may be good, bad, okay. It may be A, B, C, D, E, F. It may be a number of different measurements that aren't necessarily numeric, right? But ultimately, they've got to be converted into something numeric that can be used in the decision matrix. And sometimes these steps can be combined. If the measurement is in fact a numeric rating or ranking, right? In fact, if you have to assign a rating or ranking, it makes sense in step 3A to assign that ranking in a way that you can then use that directly as your numeric rating or ranking in your decision matrix, right? But it's often helpful to split these into separate sub-steps, or at least to understand how they are separate, they are separate parts of the same task here. So step 3A is the idea of measuring the performance of each course of action with respect to each selection criterion, right? And the easy elements are the ones that for which you can have an objective measurement, right? So obviously, if it can be monetizable, right, then we've already talked about that. It's usually your cost. We'll talk about whether or not you include the cost and why you might include it in the matrix, why you might not. But even if it's not financial, it's a non-financial impact, so it's not monetizable, it may nonetheless be objectively measured. For example, things like output, on-time percentage, accuracy, speed, customer satisfaction, employee morale, fatigue limits, etc. These are all things for which you have or can create or can deduce, right? For example, with a customer satisfaction survey, some numerical measure, right? And so the idea is to get some quantification, some measurement of these things. And it doesn't have to necessarily be numeric, but usually when you have objective measurement, it is something numeric. Now, for some of these objective measures, a higher number is better, right? Higher output is better than lower output. But others notice that the objective measurement, this step 3A here, you may have a objective measure, but it could be that a lower number is better, such as the number of defects, right? So for any objectively measurable criteria, you want to include each course of action's measurement in the data column of the decision matrix. And so hopefully you've already read that and have some idea of what I'm talking about here. We will present it in a second. But the idea is that for anything that has a objectively measurable criteria, whether it be cost, whether it be accuracy, whether it be any of these objective measures, you want to list them in the decision matrix. So then even though they don't actually get sort of multiplied, you don't add them or multiply them, they're there. And so the decision maker can then look at the ratings that you've given, and understand where the ratings come from based on the objective measurement, right? Don't throw, the idea here is the decision matrix for better or for worse, or this part is probably for worse, when you combine different criteria that are measured in different terms, you lose some of the precision. Right? And you'll see whether you rate them or rank them, you'll lose some of the precision that you get for these objective measures. And so at the very least, put the objective measures, list them in the decision matrix so that the decision maker or you yourself in reviewing it, or the analyst, him or herself, can understand sort of where those scores came from. Now the idea is that this is, with an objective measurement, you're providing both an ordinal, in other words, what's the order, what's the best course of action, as well as a cardinal, how well does each course of action perform, performance indicator, right? So, and it's sort of important here, the cardinality is important. The ordinality is sometimes something people default to, but if you can get cardinality, right? In other words, if you can figure out what my GPA is, which is a cardinal measure of my, grade point average in college or whatever, you can then from that figure out what my class rank is, which would be the ordinal. Right? But again, as long as you have objective measurement, this will make step 3B, which is assigning a rating, much easier. For better or for worse, but certainly adding to your difficulty, sometimes, you can't, get there's not a natural quantifiable, measurement, for an objective measurement of performance for each course of action. Therefore, you still got to measure them in some way. Otherwise, you can't include them in the decision making, because you can't compare them to other costs and benefits. You can't compare them. You can't compare, a particular benefit to other costs and benefits, or subtract it, or add it, or combine it. You can't compare across courses of action, right? And so, in such cases, you have to use sort of subjective measurement, some sort of subjective measurement. And there's two common types of subjective measurement: evaluation scales and numerical scales. Now, evaluation scales for subjective measurement are simply, assigning some descriptive bucket, right? It could be very simple: good, okay, or bad, for example. But it doesn't, or outstanding, marginal, adequate, whatever. But some sort of, labels or buckets for evaluating these, the performance along each criterion. A good idea is to use either 3, 5, or 7 buckets, right? Because odd numbers allow for this neutral middle, right? What if the people want to? Sometimes they're not sure whether to put things. Okay, is that a little bit above average, a little bit below average? If you don't give the option of choosing the middle, it can create a problem if they really think the performance is, right down the middle. So you want to make sure there is a middle option. You also don't necessarily want to have more than 7. Even if you keep the odd number, like 9 or 11, when you start to have 11 different buckets, really, what is the difference between, putting it in bucket 7 versus bucket 8? You're really beginning to, like a hair-splitting sort of distinctions here that will not necessarily make your conclusion any more clear. And in fact, it'll, really just bring up questions. Well, why did you rate that one an 8 instead of a 7? Or is that this one a 7 and that one an 8? Right? Because again, in that sense, you're almost making a bigger deal out of distinctions that may not really matter. Remember, we're evaluating these subjectively in the first place. It's not like we can measure these things objectively. If we could, we wouldn't be using these evaluation scales. You want to make sure you align the range of buckets with the course of action performance, and I see this happen all the time. If all the courses of action land in the same bucket, they're all good, right? Then the course of action the criterion is irrelevant. If everything is rated the same along a given criterion measure, then it's really irrelevant. And moreover, if everything is clustered, if everything, for example, let's suppose you had a 5-bucket scale, right? And everything was in the top 2 buckets, right? Then first of all, you're really, what is the point of having 5 different buckets that are all going to fit? Everybody's going to get an A or a B, in the view, as opposed to A, B, C, D, F. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it actually, if you know how you sort of normalize grades, and I think we'll talk about this in a later slide as well. I talk about with my students that I in my other courses in particular where we have multiple sort of assignments, I have to normalize the scores. In other words, if you have if you didn't do this, for example, let's suppose you had 2 tests that were your entire grade, and in a course, and on one test everybody scored between 90 and 100, and on the second test everybody scored between 60 and 100. So in the second test there was a wide range of different scores. Right? If you then weight them equally, 50-50, right? And then then basically assign grades based on your relative standing within the course. What you've basically done, you've just made the second test 4 times as important as the first, because the first test only has a 10-point range and the other one has a 40-point range. So what's really going to drive differences in how well in how people overall course grade, it's going to be the second test. The second test has suddenly become 4 times as important as the first, even though you said you give them 50-50, 50% of weight on each of those. It turns out that if the range is much greater on one than the other, then the one that has the greater range is going to be much more significant in determining which in that case students, but in this case courses of action, which course of actions outperform the others. So you really want to make sure you're sort of ideally using the entire range of buckets. Right. Otherwise, adjust your measurement here. It's important to get multiple opinions. Some people, the idea is that in some cases, some people will say, oh, well, that should be rated good. Some will say it should be rated okay. Don't necessarily just use your judgment as an analyst. Certainly not suggesting that individual analyst can't judge these things, but it certainly has more credibility with the decision maker and other outside parties if it's been, based on multiple informed people, or subject matter experts. And moreover, it's replicable, meaning that if somebody else did the same analyses, they could come up with the same results, because if they also looked to subject matter experts, and looked to several of them, right? The idea is if I asked people, who they're going to vote for here in these midterm elections, if I asked 5 people, I'm not going to get, I might get one result. If somebody else asks 5 people, they'll get maybe a different result. But if we each asked 5,000 people, right, it would be very unlikely that we would get significantly different results in terms of who they were going to vote for. So now I'm not suggesting you ask 5,000 people, but the point is the more people you poll, the more reliable that measurement is. Well, besides evaluation scales, the other sort of subjective measurement is numerical scales, right? And this is simply, instead of doing good, bad, okay, the idea is rate them on a scale from 1 to 10, right? This is actually in many ways sort of a little preferred because it allows, it does make step 3B, we'll get to in a second, much easier. But similarly, as I said before, you want to align the numerical scale with the range of course of action performance. So you don't want to have everything get a 9 or a 10. Right, on your scale. If so, you have to adjust your scale, because what's happened is if you do everything by, everything is given a 9 or a 10 on our 10-point scale, then you are, you are missing some distinctions between courses of action, and 2, you are making that criterion very unimportant. You can put any weight you want on it. If the range of scores is not normalized, and so the range of scores is for one criterion is much larger than the range of scores on another criterion, what you have done, whether you intended to or not, is reduced the importance of the criterion which has a lower range of scores. Again, same thing, poll multiple informed people or subject matter experts to get the aggregate assessment. The important thing is, now one thing, the danger here is that when you do numeric scales, it gives you the illusion of objectivity. Right? If I see things rated, this was rated an 8, this is rated a 10, is that really any different than this is rated excellent and this is rated good? The answer is no. There's no difference there. Each are subjective, but when I write excellent or good, people people know in their mind that's subjective, but sometimes people get fooled by these numeric scales. They think they're some sort of objective measurement when they're not. So let's not, don't fool yourselves but to thinking that these are objective measures, because they're not. So once we've got that, like step from 3A, remember, was again to measure the performance of each course of action on each criterion. Once you've done that, then you've got to convert those to a numeric rating or ranking, which is consistent across all criteria, right? And so the idea is that if something is rated from 1 to 10, something is rated has an objective measure, for example, customer satisfaction percentage. Something else has the number, is rated objectively the output per day, the number of defects per month, whatever. You've got to take whatever those measures are and put them all on the same. You've got to compare apples to apples. You've got to use the same yardstick. And so what we do then is we convert all of these evaluations, all of these measurements into a common scale. And this is the idea of some sort of numeric scale, consistent across all criteria, right? Now, if you have objective performance measures, that converts easily, right? Obviously, if you have, for example, if output ranges from, 10 to, 200, and you want to then convert it to this numeric rating that, you want to convert everything to ratings between scale of 1 to 10, right? Well, then you can assign 1 to output of 10, 10 to an output of 200, and scale everything appropriately, even to decimals. You don't have to, something can get a rating of 6.2, right? But the idea is that you're putting everything along the same measurement. Now, that said, even if you have objective measures, make sure you realize that, if in some cases, right, you may have to invert the measurements. For example, defects or time to completion of task. Like the faster you complete a task, the lower your time score is going to be, but the higher your numeric rating has to be, in the decision matrix. You've also got to convert, of course, these subjective measures. As I mentioned, objective measures are easy to convert, but what about subjective measures? Well, they're a little more problematic. If it's a numeric scale, it might seem easy to convert. That said, it's still subjective. But when you have evaluation scales like good, okay, bad, well, how do you convert that, right? Here's an example. Suppose you just have 3 buckets: good, okay, and bad. In one case, let's say you're going to assign good a rating of 3, okay a rating of 2, bad a rating of 1. Another one, good a rating of 2, okay a rating of 1, bad a rating of 0, right? Well, which is right? They might seem to not matter, but it does, right? The idea is that, in one case, good is twice as much as good as okay, whereas another, good is only 50% better than okay, right? And so the idea again is it's not clear exactly what's the right thing to do, but that's why we have to be very careful with the decision matrix and not use it as a decision aid, not a decision maker, and also to make sure we conduct sensitivity analysis to understand what would happen if you get a different result when you score things according to example 1 than you do example 2. That's something that should be reported to the decision maker. Now, one of the things that is interesting here is the issue of rating versus ranking. And I find a lot of stuff, that the Army puts out, that others put out in cost-benefit analysis, really confuses the two. They'll talk about rating, but then they'll actually do a ranking. Or they'll talk about ranking and do a rating. And again, ranking is to make sure we understand the difference here. That ranking is the ordinal measure, right? First, second, third, fourth. What is your if you have an ordinal measure or ranking, then every course of action will have a different number, in terms of performance on each criterion. But the rating can be a cardinal measure, right? 9, 25%, 3.1415, in other words, pi, right? That's the idea, some cardinal measure. And so for example, if we're going to rate things on a scale of 1 to 10, and you're not going to, even if there were 10 criteria, you're not going to rank them 1 to 10. There might be 2 things rated 3, 1 thing rated 1, another thing rated 10, right? Ranking is often easier, right? It's easier for me to say, I can tell you that I like, say, Rocky Road ice cream better than, vanilla ice cream. Actually, I'm not sure that's true, but let's just go with it. If I like Rocky Road better than vanilla, that's easier for me to say than, well, how much? Do you like it 50% better, 20% better? And so sometimes people, prefer to do rankings because they're easier, but it can create problems, right? Suppose you, for example, suppose you rank the three courses of action first through third. Well, automatically, right? Suddenly, guess what? If you give the best one a score of 3 and the lowest one a score of 1, you've suddenly decided that course of action number, the one that gets a 3 is 300%, better. Has a 300%, performance relative to the other one, and so you're by ranking as a set of rating, you are dictating what the gaps will be in terms of measurement. So the idea is you might have three courses of action that perform relatively close to each other, but on a criterion. But by ranking them, you've suddenly made it so one will mathematically come out as if it's 3 times better than the other one. On the other hand, also, what if something is 5 times better? What if one course of action is 5 times better than another? Well, if you're only have 3 courses of action and you're ranking them from 1, 2, and 3, then guess what? What's going to happen is, even though it's 5 times better, at best you could make it, 3 times as good as the other one. And so again, the ranking is problematic because it arbitrarily sort of decides how big the gaps will be, in the scoring in the matrix. Right. Also note, by the way, you've got to invert the rankings, right? So the idea is that if you rank something, whatever course of action is ranked first on a criterion actually has to have, the highest number, and whatever is ranked last has to have the lowest, ranked, 5th has to have, maybe if there's 5 courses of action, whatever is ranked first has to have a rank of 5, and whatever is ranked 5th has to have a rank of 1, right? But again, I prefer ratings as opposed to rankings whenever that is possible, but rankings are often easier. Further guidance, obviously you must assign higher numbers to better performance. That may seem obvious, but again, it's often the case that if it's something sort of how long does something take, time, defects, these are objective measures for which a low number is better. So you've got to convert them to make it so that you assign a higher number to the better performance. Also, obviously, if ranking, if you're in first place, you actually want to invert that so you have a higher number associated with the higher performer. The range of rating values should be the same for each criterion. This is what I talked about before, is the idea that, look, if everything is, if one criterion, everything is between, 8, 9, and 10, the other one, it ranges from 1 to 10, what you've suddenly done is you've devalued the criterion, which has a lower range. The range of rating values should be greater than the number of courses of action, for several reasons. If you have, for example, if you have 5 courses of action and you're rating them on a scale from 1 to 5, it's sort of natural to end up ranking them, and that's not necessarily what you want to do for the reasons we just talked about, right? The idea is that it also, if you have 5 criterion and 5-point scale rating, you're basically dictating that how big the gaps have to be between them, and if you in fact have a 10-point scale, right, you could clearly be able to rank them from 1 to 5, but it might be that number 1 gets a rating of 10, number 2 gets a rating of 9, but number 3 gets a rating of 7 or 6. And so again, it's important to have more possible rating values than you have course of action. And again, as before, an odd number scale is often preferable just so you could have this midpoint rating, although I see people don't do it a lot. So here is the line of credit example. And again, remember, we have these different criterions: interest rate, upfront fees, sides of line, restrictions, advance rate, unused line fee, default rate, friendliness. We had the weight for each of them. And here we have the rating. Some of them looked like rankings, 4, 2, 3, 1. But then I noticed things like, because this example I inherited, if you will. Here's 1, 3, 4, 1. So that suggests that it's not a ranking; it is in fact a rating. I think they're limiting themselves by having everything's from 1, 2, 3, and 4. As I mentioned before, I would be more comfortable if I saw ratings on a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 point, 10 point scale. Since you have 4 courses of action, it's easy here to confuse. Is this a rating or is this a ranking? I actually had to look at the number to figure out whether it was a rating or a ranking. And as you can see, because we have, here we have 2 2s and no 1, it's clearly a rating. Now, the next step 4, is to calculate the criterion scores for each course of action. So each course of action's criterion score is determined by multiplying its criterion weight by the course of action criterion rating. So again, each COA's criterion score is the weight for that criterion times the criterion rating. And so in our example here, right, so here we take now for each of our this is our line of credit example, right? We take the weight, 8 times 4 is 32, 8 times 2 is 16, 8 times 3 is 24, 8 times 1 is 8. So you multiply the weight of each criterion times the rating of each course of action on that criterion to get a score for each course of action on each criterion. These are the criterion scores. And the final step is then to sum those criterion scores to find the overall scores. Right? So each course of action's overall score is simply the sum of all its criterion scores, which, because the criterion score is the weight times the criterion rating, it's the sum of the weights. It's sort of a weighted average of each of your criterion ratings, with the weights being the weight for each criterion. Now, and then the optimal alternative to choose is whichever course of action has the highest overall score, right? But again, the important point is remember that this is subjective. It's somewhat fuzzy. So don't blindly choose whichever course of action has the highest score. You've got to do sensitivity analysis. You've got to, it is again a decision aid, not a decision maker, right? And you certainly should always perform sensitivity analysis when using this decision matrix because of that subjective nature. What happens if we assign different weights? What happens if we assign different ratings? How does that change our recommendations? So in our example here, so here was our example from before. We already calculated the weight. Step 1 was identifying the criteria. Step 2 was assigning a weight for each criteria. Step 3 was assigning a rating, and it says rank here, but it's actually it's actually rating. I should change that in the slides. But for each criterion. Step 4 was then to determine a score for each course of action on each criterion, which is simply the weight times the rank. And so then this last step, step 5, is to figure out the total score. So you just add up all of these scores to get a total score for each course of action here at the bottom. And we look and see, okay, it looks like lender number 3 is the winner, right? Because at least, again, as I mentioned, we've got to look and conduct sensitivity analysis. But what we see is that the one with the maximum total score is the recommendation, is sort of the chosen course of action, that comes out of the decision matrix. So those are the 5 steps. Let me give some examples, some Army examples. These are actual examples that I found either in Army publications or Army presentations. Other than the Army preposition stocks case, which I will present analyses of that, but we want to discuss those in class. So here's the example that was actually in the CBA guide, which I gave you that excerpt to read for this week. There are 3 alternatives in that example. There's 1 financial criterion, which is life cycle cost. There are 4 non-financial criteria, which are maintenance downtime, reduced error rate, suitability, and improved productivity. And in the example, they assigned weights of 0.4, 0.25, 0.20, and 0.15. Notice that they chose to have their weights summed to 1, which is fine. Again, not necessary. This could have been 40, 25, 20, and 15, and you would have gotten the same recommendation. But it's sometimes helpful to think in terms of things that percentages that rank, that sum to 1. So here we have the different course of action 1, course of action 2, course of action 3. And so this is how they were rated in the example in the reading according to the non-financial selection criteria. And so we see, again, here's the different non-financial criteria: maintenance downtime, reduced error rate, suitability, improved productivity. The weights, which again total to 1. The data, again, notice that you put in the data. So what's the maintenance downtime? 10 hours, 7 hours, 14 hours. Reduced error rate, 5 per 100, 2.5 per 100, 8 per 100. Suitability, very good, good, excellent. Notice there's numerical measures, objective measures, subjective measures, but again, different sort of measures, and you put the data here, the measurement along each criteria. Then you take that data, here's 10, 7, 14, assign a rating, 9, 7, 4. Notice, for example, here the higher number, 14 hours, gets a lower rating because maintenance downtime is something you want to minimize. Here, good, very good, good, excellent. They decided to, give 2 for good, 4 for very good, 6 for excellent. Notice, by the way, nothing was rated bad, right? And again, but by you might, as I mentioned, you sort of want to make sure you're using all the buckets. And so if you're only using the good, very good, and excellent bucket, that's fine, but make sure you sort of spread out the ratings there. The scores are then simply the weight times the rating. You see that? And then you get the total score, you sum it up. And in this example, the example in your reading, course of action 1 had the greatest total score on the non-financial selection criteria. What's not included in this matrix, right, is cost. And in some cases, I've seen where the Army recommends you do include cost, some you don't. In this particular example, the cost is not included. But they combine the cost data or the financial criteria with the non-financial criteria. But here we have sort of the rating according to the non-financial criteria. We have the financial data, which is the life cycle cost, right? So it's 24 million, 20, 19 million, right? And so you might look at this and say, okay, well, in terms of performance on these sort of benefits or these non-financial measures, right? Course of action 1 is the optimal. According to minimize cost, course of action 3 would be optimal. But to combine them, what they recommend doing is what's called a cost benefit index, which is simply, it's really what's your buck per bang, right? So it's cost divided by the benefit score. So how much does it cost, for each sort of, point of performance that you get in the decision matrix. And here, when you do the division, right, you get a 3.5, 3.33, 4.52. Notice, again, when using cost benefit index, this is cost per benefit. So you want to have a low score. So in this case, the course of action 2 has the lowest score, 3.33. So that, in other words, gives a benefit of 6 at a cost of 2. So that's the, $3.33 million per point of benefit. And so that's one way, and this is an example of combining the cost data or financial data with the non-financial data without actually including the financial data in the decision matrix. Another Army example, this is straight from a presentation, the Army CBA presentation. And what we have here, so here's the cost of the different courses of action, 20, 16, 12, millions of dollars, $20 billion, $16 million, $12 million. Decision matrix, so we have these weapon systems, I guess, lethality, safety, survivability. The different weights that are assigned, again, in this example, they sum to 1. They don't necessarily have to. The scores, the ratings, are given to the different course of action. We get a total score for each rating, for each course of action. Finally, we do the cost per benefit, right? And so we do, here 20 divided by 6 is 20 divided by 6 is 3.33. 16 divided by 5.8, 2.78. 12 divided by 4.1 is 2.96. And so notice that, course of action 3 has the lowest cost. Course of action 1 has the highest benefit, but course of action 2 is the best value, right? When you combine you get sort of the cost per benefit. Course of action 2 gives you the lowest cost per benefit. And so the suggestion here is that when you combine the non-financial and the financial criteria in that way, you will, course of action 2 would be the choice. Now, the last sort of slides I have here are really sort of about some what I call ex post guidance. Okay, so having gone through those examples, what sort of general lessons can we learn about doing this? The first thing is that you can sometimes simplify the matrix after step 3, which is the rating or ranking of each. You rate or rank each course of action on each criterion. You can simplify the matrix by safely first either eliminating any criterion that doesn't vary across courses of action, eliminating any course of action dominated by the one or more other course of action. So the first one, if you do the rating or ranking and you find out that, guess what, all courses of action that have met the screening criteria pretty much rate the same on this selection criteria. Therefore, we really don't need that selection criteria in our decision matrix because it's not going to help us. It doesn't tell us anything. Everything scores the same. We can then also possibly eliminate courses of action that are dominated by one or more other courses of action. So in other words, if you have one course of action that outperforms, is outperformed by another, on every dimension, then you can take it out of the matrix, right then and there and focus on the ones that remain. This is helpful when you have many different courses of action. Now that said, it requires that all selection criteria be included in the decision matrix, right? So if cost is kept separate, you can't eliminate a course of action just because it is dominated by another course of action in the decision matrix if the decision matrix only includes, for example, the benefits, right? But when you've chosen to include all of the decision criteria in the decision matrix, which sometimes is done, right? And a course of action is inferior or is outperformed or equally performed on every measure by another course of action. You can, right then and there, sort of eliminate that course of action from attention. For example, suppose we're trying to choose between different big screen TV alternatives. We have one from Sony, one from Vizio, one from Samsung. We rate them in terms of price, Sony must be the cheapest. Samsung's and Vizio the most expensive here. 1037, we rate them in terms of screen size, rate them in terms of warranty, rate them in terms of image quality, and we get the following decision matrix. Well, the first thing is notice that every one of these TVs must have the same warranty. They all got a score of 5 on warranty. So therefore, we can eliminate the warranty criterion because all the alternatives have the same rating. So we don't need to include that in our decision matrix. We also can eliminate Vizio because, again, Samsung outperforms it on all criteria. So 7 is bigger than 3, 6 is bigger than 4, 8 is bigger than 6. So again, we could eliminate Vizio from consideration and then just focus on comparing Samsung to Sony, right? And notice we haven't even done sort of the weighting here yet, but we haven't included the weighting of the different criteria, right? Incidentally, notice that Samsung dominates Vizio, Sony does not, right? Because although 10 is greater than 3, 4 is greater than 2, so Vizio is a greater screen size. So we couldn't, comparing Sony and Vizio, we couldn't eliminate Vizio, but comparing Samsung and Vizio, Samsung dominates Vizio in each measure, is at least as good on each measure as Vizio. But then notice that even though Samsung dominates Vizio and Sony does not dominate Vizio, Samsung does not dominate Sony. In other words, 7, here we have 7 is, the 6 is greater than 2, 8 is greater than 4, but 7 is less than 10. So again, the idea here is to simplify your matrix by eliminating courses of action, criteria that are the same across courses of action, and then eliminating courses of action that are dominated by other courses of action on all criteria, right? And then we can sort of proceed with a simpler decision matrix. Another bit of guidance is what about splitting one criterion into many? And sometimes, for example, it's generally best, for example, to combine all monetized criteria. Whether if you have the cost is obviously usually monetized, but if you have benefits that are monetized, that are in financial terms, include those, combine those to be your net cost or net benefit or net quantifiable benefit or net quantifiable cost, right? Because if you do separate scoring of those, you're going to lose all the precision that you have in the dollar values. If you just do a score for the financial benefit and score for the financial cost, you're going to lose important distinctions there. So the idea is it's better to combine those monetized criteria into one. For example, it's troubling when you sort of split cost into sub-criteria, right? Sometimes you might have materials cost, labor cost, tooling costs, and so on, right? It may add valuable detail about the cost elements, that you can observe in the decision matrix, but it can lead to overweighting of the split criterion, right? The idea is that if I list all the cost elements, it's natural to assign, if I gave you 5 different cost elements, as opposed to combining them, psychologically, what tends to happen is people tend to, assign a little bit of weight to each one, and the sum of the weights ends up being greater than what you would have weighted overall cost in the first place. But if you still want to split your one criterion into many, make sure the weight is appropriately split. So, for example, if cost, should be 50% of your decision, and then you want to break it into materials, labor, and tooling costs, make sure the weights that you put on each of those better sum to the same amount, the 50%, which is the weight you put on cost overall. All right, so that's the guidance in terms of splitting one criterion into many. What about dealing with cost in the decision matrix? As I've mentioned before, there's mixed guidance as to whether or not cost should be included among the criteria in the matrix. So here's reasons why it's good. There's problems with including it. There's also problems with excluding it. So here's the issues with including the cost in the matrix. First of all, the weight given to cost can have a heavy influence on results, right? And so we'll sort of see. I've seen a number of examples where people sort of are, I feel like they're pretending they're concerned about all these different criteria, but they put such a high weight on cost that in the end, the other criterion end up being irrelevant, right? It's also it's not necessarily clear that a linear scoring of cost is even appropriate, right? So the idea is if you're going to put a numerical value on different cost measures, right? How do you do that? Do you rank them? Do you rate them? Is a 6 million cost exactly 2 times as bad as a 3 million cost, right? And so you want to give have the score difference of even 2. It's not clear, exactly how you would score cost. Now that said, it's not clear how you would score these other things either. And there's this temptation to give, each measure, its own criterion, return on investment, NPV, benefit cost ratio, but these all sort of measure similar things, right? I've seen also the Army, and I understand why they separate these, but budget impact versus total lifetime cost. I know they measure different things, but in some sense, what happens by including both of them in the matrix, you tend to maybe end up giving high weight. The combined weight ends up being pretty high, and cost becomes even more significant in your matrix. Now, what about excluding cost? Well, if you exclude cost, right, from the matrix, you're not done. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, we shouldn't really, because part of the philosophy is, look, we have this really nice, precise measure of cost. Why throw it into the decision matrix where we've got to do it on a scale from 1 to 10, and we lose all the precision? Yes, but in the end, you got to do something, right? If you have a decision matrix with non-financial criteria and then you have cost, you got to combine them somehow. Either you put the cost in the matrix itself, right? Or as even the example where the Army recommended approach that I just sort of gave you, where they find this cost benefit index, right? What they're doing is they're saying what you do is do the matrix score for the non-financial measures and then divide the cost by the matrix score. Well, okay, but in some sense, why that, right? Why should it be a ratio? Why should you combine cost and benefits into a ratio instead of a weighted sum, which is what you'd get if cost was in the decision matrix? So in other words, it's not clear that that they're sort of, in some sense, going through the motions of keeping them separate. In the end, they get combined. Right? And so the question is simply, what's the right way to combine them? Is it the right way to combine them by doing a ratio? There's appeal to that, but there's also, why not assign a weight to cost and include it as a weighted sum of the overall score? So another sort of ex post guidance is, what about these ratings and weights? These are very, very subjective, obviously, right? And these really can dictate the choices you make. So how do you determine, the ratings and weights? What are defensible? If you've got to, just defend a cost-benefit analysis, and you've got to defend the weights and ratings that you selected, how do you defend it? Well, so who should decide? Well, the one option is that the analyst or the team that's doing the cost-benefit analysis can themselves decide on the ratings and the weights. Right. It certainly could be reasonable, right? I mean, if you do a thorough cost-benefit analysis, you might be an expert in that area now. But the idea is there's the possibility of bias, or at least the appearance of bias. Even the idea is it's better to appeal to somebody outside the analysis, because otherwise, even if you're not biased, even if you're a very good rating, you're very good, determining the rates and the weightings, the idea is there might be appearance of bias. Another option is ask subject matter experts. You sort of talk to the SMEs about, okay, so how would you rate these different courses of action in their terms of their performance on some subjective measure, right? Impact on the environment or impact on the community or whatever, and they may have the knowledge necessary to assign accurate numbers more so than the team, right? And it sort of reduces the appearance of bias or the possibility of bias. The third option is determined by a broader group, right? The idea is the wisdom of the crowd, sort of, even to have multiple subject matter experts, better than the one. Right, or even a group of non-experts can be pretty, accurate. I talk about the wisdom of the crowd here. Is that if you ask a group of people, maybe combine that with subject matter expert opinions, sort of calibrate, see how you get. But again, these are different ways to sort of make sure that your ratings and weights are defensible. So, in sum, on the decision matrix, what are the pros and the cons? So the pros of the decision matrix are: it does add discipline to the choice process. It's relatively easy to use. It's a somewhat familiar tool. It's actually, if you go back to the very first day of class in the Benjamin Franklin letter, that's what he did, right? He basically listed the pros and listed the cons, assigned a weight to each, a score to each. It's basically what Ben Franklin did, in his decision. So it's not something that we're not familiar with or we can't understand. It normalizes the costs and benefits, so it makes everything on a common yardstick, right? It's flexible and broadly applicable. It can be applied to when you have a lot of non-monetary, non-monetizable, sort of criterion. A caveat, of course, you can or should do sensitivity analysis on the ratings and weights, right? Because that's the way to assess the robustness of the result. You really, if you're using decision matrix, you better have a sensitivity analysis that says, what if we weighted things differently? What if we rated things differently? Right? The cons are, of course, it is subjective and judgmental. Choosing the criteria, choosing the ratings, choosing the weights. Those are all subjective decisions. Those aren't objective decisions. This is not like just financial net benefit. Right? It's easy to bias things for or against a course of action. I can, based on how I rate that course of action, how I weight different criteria, it's easy to, in a very subtle way, to bias the results towards or against, for or against a course of action. As I mentioned, it's unclear how to incorporate cost. Should it be in the matrix? Should it not be in the matrix? Different views on that. But therefore, because of subjectivity, because it's not clear how to incorporate cost, the results are not definitive, right? Again, it's a decision aid, not a decision tool. I'm sorry, decision aid, not a decision maker, right? Also, when we normalize things, right? When you normalize things on a scale from 1 to 10 or whatever, we've got to get this common rating. We do lose detail, right? If you have precise sort of output per minute, and then you convert it to a scale from 1 to 10, you're losing the detail there. It's sometimes an excuse to avoid monetization, right? Sometimes these benefits, as we talked about in the prior lecture, there are ways to monetize, non-monetary benefits, but sometimes it's hard work. So, let's just put it on a scale from 1 to 10, right? So it can be used as a crutch to avoid monetization. It can instill false confidence in a questionable choice, right? The idea is, look, we've got all the numbers say this, we put it in the model and it comes out, right? It makes sort of guesswork look like science sometimes, right? The idea is you assign numbers. In the end, it sort of makes it look like it's less subjective than it is. And so it can blind you to the fact that you really are making a subjective assessment by, you assign numbers to it, somehow it makes it seem more scientific. So again, just to summarize what we've done. Remember, in previous weeks we talked about the easy stuff, the stuff that was quantifiable and directly monetizable, right? And in the prior lecture, we talked about things that are quantifiable and maybe not directly monetizable, things like the value of life, the value of time. But we talked about ways in which you could indirectly monetize them. And today, in today's lecture, we really talked about the idea, what are the things that don't fall into those categories, that are really not quantifiable or not directly quantifiable or not monetizable. How do we incorporate those in cost-benefit analysis? And we showed how we can use multi-criteria decision-making, and in particular the decision matrix, to include those impacts in cost-benefit analysis. All right, that's it.